Today's topic is on biological diversity. And what we're going to do is we are going to investigate and interpret the diversity among species and describe how this diversity actually helps species survive. So today's learning outcome is to understand variation in living things and how it's able to give and then how to be able to give examples of variation. I'm looking for you to be able to define the terms community and population, identify diversity, that it is due to variation in populations. So look at examples of diversity and variation within our classroom or within people around you, and define the term speciation and genetic mutation and explain their role in creating variations. So this is, again, just kind of what we're covering today, diversity among species, within species, and how it contributes to survival. So we're going to skip a bit of this, but we're going to start here by talking about what is biological diversity. So biological diversity is the number and variety of organisms in an ecosystem. This is super important for the health and survival of the communities and keeping those ecosystems stable. The more variety of organisms, the healthier the environment is. So we say the greater biological diversity, the greater chance of survival. Now, that survival comes when there is a change that happens in the environment. For example, if all of a sudden one day in the rainforest it started to snow, a lot of species would be in trouble. Okay, they're very, very set to their ways of how it works in a rainforest. However, because there are so many species in the rainforest, there are going to be some that are able to survive a snowfall. So the greater diversity, the more animals there are, the chances that there's going to be likelihood of some of those surviving. So I'm going to link this video in to watch here in a minute. But we're going to talk about the three different types of diversity that is found: ecosystem, species, and genetic. So we're going to start with the ecosystem diversity. So ecosystems, as a definition, are any place on the earth where both living things, which we call biotic, and non-living things, which we call abiotic, are interacting together. So there's lots of different types of ecosystems on Earth. You have bogs, marshes, lakes, forests. A city, for example, is an ecosystem. They're all different because essentially it's where living things and things that are non-living interact. Now, non-living things are like water, rocks. Remember, they're components to living things. So any non-living things mixing with living things is an ecosystem. Species diversity comes from the different types of organisms that live on our Earth. Now, to define species, this is a very key thing. It's a group of organisms that are similar in genetics and how they look, but they can breed, so they can mate and produce successfully, okay? So what that means is if you have these two king penguins, they can breed, they can create a little baby penguin. That baby penguin has to be able to have babies in order for these penguins to be considered the same species. So a species has to be able to breed and reproduce successfully. This is an example of when you have things that are able to breed but are not the same species. Sometimes things can breed and we'll call them hybrids. Hybrids are pretty cool. There's a lot to learn about hybrids. We don't get really into a ton of it. But usually hybrids end up being males, or usually, but they're incapable of being able to reproduce, and some of them are not even able to survive in the wild because they don't have any of the adaptations needed. This is a very common one. You can mate a horse and a donkey together, and you get something called a mule. Now, a mule is genetically sterile, meaning it's born to not be able to have children. So it's born and it will never have children. There's ligers, lions and tigers mixed, or tigons, which is a tiger and a lion mixed. There's lots of different types of hybrids out there that you would never see in the actual world because A, either the animals don't live near each other, or B, they can't produce and create more to the species. So this is another example, the lion and the tigress. So tigress being the female lion will make a liger. A liger is like huge compared to the lion and the tiger. So lions actually have a unique genetic set that allow for their heads to stay within proportion of their body. So there's actually like a stop codon within their genetics that says, hey, don't get too big. Your head's getting too big. It's not going to be good. The tigers don't actually have that gene. So when you create a liger, you actually have an animal that's head is absolutely massive and its body size is huge. So ligers are quite big, but genetically, I'm sorry, not genetically, in the wild, you would never see these exist because tigers and lions don't live in the same environment. Same if you took a male tiger and a female lioness, you would get a tigon. Okay, again, they don't live within the same environments, so you would not see them out in the wild. These two ligers and tigons are created within captivity. Again, both of them sterile and not able to reproduce. That leads us into this idea of genetic diversity, looking at the genes. So this is when you have different variations within the same species. So as humans, we have different hair color, different eye colors, heights, weights, okay, skin tones. These are variations. Our genetics cause us to look a little bit different. So it happens within our cells. Members of the same species don't look alike every single time. There's a lot of differences. Sometimes they're not visible. Sometimes it's maybe the way they act or behave. Identical twins look exactly the same on the outside, but sometimes you can tell the difference between them because one, the way that they talk with their hands or a behavior that they do may show that they are not the same as their sibling. That's going to take us into this idea of populations and communities. So we had ecosystems, the big idea of where animals live. Within that, there are species that live in those ecosystems, and inside those species, we can have genetic diversity. But what we have to understand is that ecosystems are made up out of populations and communities. So species live together in groups usually, and we call those a population, a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area. So that would be, for example, just the king penguins. That would be a population. Or if we're looking at this picture, the seals in that picture is just a population. But when we combine this picture together and we see the seals with the penguins, we actually see a community. This is when a bunch of populations are living together and sharing resources. I will link this video in as well. That's going to lead us into pretty much the most important part of our conversation today, which is variation. So when we look at populations, communities, ecosystems, we have to really start with the species. And we have to figure out how are species varying from one another, or how are they varying within their groups. So speciation is the idea of the evolution of different species from a single ancestor. Okay, it requires separation and the isolation of two populations of the same species. It can take a really, really, really long time, and it results in species adapting to suit their environment. We are humans, and our names are Homo sapiens as our scientific name. Humans are not what we see in our everyday life, was not some of the first bipedal people to be on this earth. Bipedal meaning walking on two legs. You had the Neanderthals and Homo erectus. There was a different subset of humans that existed. And as evolution occurred, we then became Homo sapiens. So it's the same idea, speciation. We all had a common ancestor, a single ancestor. And as we evolved through the years, some of us survived and some of us did not. Speciation is usually caused by something like a geographic barrier, something that's physical, okay? For example, if all of a sudden you put a set of mountains somewhere, all of a sudden you can't cross the mountains, you're creating a barrier. So geographic barriers are physical barriers that cause separation that eventually can lead to speciation. Again, I will link this video in. Another reason that you can have variation is biological barriers. Biological barriers are things that cause species within themselves to not be able to mate with each other. So a biological process might be like a mating call or a dance or some sort of supremacy. Okay, so that's what you're seeing there. If they don't want to mate, then they can't pass on their genetics. Genetic mutation is another one that is a big cause of variation. Inside your body, you have DNA. DNA is the code that makes up you. You're made up of half of your mom's DNA and half of your dad's DNA. And when it comes together, it makes up you. You're made out of A's, T's, C's, and G's, essentially. Now, sometimes what happens is you can have a change up to your DNA. We call those point mutations, silent mutations. There's tons of different types of mutations. But essentially what happens is if you get a mutation, it's going to cause a little bit of variation to your genetics. Now, some mutations can be very bad and some can do nothing. And then there's some that just causes variation. So I will link in the Bill Nye video. And this is just kind of a last kind of few things that are affecting biological diversity. So now we know what biodiversity is, a variety of species living in the same environment. These are things that can cause biodiversity to drop, creating roads or creating cities, farming, pollution, removing of the natural resources such as trees, coal, mining for other stuff, tourism and recreation, or what we call non-native species. All of these have an effect that can cause biological diversity to decrease. So how do animals survive if we are constantly invading their spaces or if things are changing in their environment? How do they survive? And that comes down to the word adaptations. These are inherited structures or behaviors that organisms possess to increase their chance of reproducing. So they develop adaptations and then they become more diverse. So an adaptation actually causes you to be more biologically diverse. So you can have adaptations such as sharp claws, you can be able to lose a tail, you can have camouflage, you can sing a special song. There are tons of ways that animals have adapted to suit their environments as well as be more biologically diverse. So again, this comes down to genetic diversity. It helps the species survive. So when your parents had you, they passed on their DNA to you. That had a little bit of mutations that caused variation, so it caused genetic diversity. Now, this may help you survive certain situations. Now, humans, we have all other things, but animals have to worry about things like climate change, predators, spread of diseases, toxic substances, and elimination of their food source. A great example right now is spread of diseases. We are currently dealing with a pandemic. There are going to be some people on this earth who are actually immune to the coronavirus. And that is because there's something within their genetics that causes them to be diverse or different than maybe the mass population. That helps them survive. That helps them in the long run. If they can't get the disease that could kill them, then they're going to survive and pass on their genetics. And eventually, you may have more and more people who are more immune to the virus. So variation, again, is very, very important because if a animal runs into a problem, an infection, a pest, a pandemic, okay, there is ways for them to survive. Okay, so variations then can get passed down to their offspring. So individuals have genes and they're either there to help them survive and reproduce, and then they pass it on to their offspring. Now, what you have to understand is that as an individual, you can't change your genetics, okay? So this beaver here is saying he wants something like a chainsaw, chainsaw, chainsaw. He doesn't want to chew on that lovely tree anymore, okay? Now, he's not going to just get a chainsaw. Okay, it's not just going to magically appear on him. But what it does is this is just showing you that there are some advantages to having variation within a species. If the beaver could have a chainsaw, he would be much more efficient at cutting down trees. So again, I'll show you a few other variations and adaptations that animals have. Here's an example of an owl. So an owl has what we would call a structural adaptation. So there's two types, behavioral and structural. An owl hunting at night is a behavioral adaptation because he's choosing to hunt at night. His body has then changed to be able to hunt at night because he's trying to eliminate competition from food. His eyes, this owl's eyes, are an example of structural adaptations. It's something on its body that has changed so that he can see at night to hunt. This hummingbird's long, long beak is what we would call a structural adaptation. Its idea is to migrate back and forth between southern Mexico, the States, and Alberta is what we would call a behavioral adaptation. So that's a lot of information in one video. So If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will talk to you soon.